In this video, we're going to pick up our discussion with conditional sentences by moving on to talking about conditional arguments. What we're going to look at in this video are two good types of arguments using conditionals, two types of successful, valid deductive arguments, and then we're going to look at two types of fallacious, bad arguments that can be given using conditionals that look an awful lot like the good ones. But let's start with one of the good ones. It's called affirming the antecedent. And this is an example of such an argument. Okay, so in all cases of affirming the antecedent, the first premise is going to be a conditional. The conditional here is if we drive nonstop to the coast, and remember, this is the antecedent, we drive nonstop to the coast, then we will need 2 days to recover. The then isn't actually written here, often it's just implied, but this is the consequent. We will need 2 days to recover. So we've got our conditional sentence, antecedent, we drive nonstop to the coast, then consequent, we will need 2 days to recover. That's the first premise. The second premise asserts the antecedent. It affirms the antecedent. That's why this kind of argument is called affirming the antecedent. So the second premise just is our antecedent. We are driving nonstop to the coast, and then from there we conclude we will need 2 days to recover. So this argument is valid. What does that mean? That means that if both the premises are true, then the conclusion is true as well. So the way to test out that it's valid is imagine that both the premises are true. Imagine that if it's the case that if we drive nonstop to the coast, we'll need 2 days to recover. Then imagine that we're driving nonstop to the coast, and you can see that it follows that we're going to need 2 days to recover. As we learned last time, the form of this argument is sufficient to show that it's true. So this is the form. If P, then Q, for the first premise. Second premise P, conclusion therefore Q. It doesn't matter what P is or what Q is. Anytime you've got an argument with this form, it's going to be valid, meaning that if both the premises are true, then the conclusion will also be true. But you might be thinking, hey, what about an argument like this? If you are a human, then you are invisible. You are a human, therefore you are invisible. Clearly, this conclusion is false. You're right, this conclusion is false. And you might say, also, clearly this is a case of affirming the antecedent. You're right, it is. So what's going on? Well, the answer is that the form of the argument only shows that the argument is valid. It doesn't show that the argument is also sound. Remember, a sound argument is a valid argument with all true premises. The problem is, this conditional is not true. It's not the case that if you're a human, then you are invisible. But when checking for validity, you have to ask yourself, what if all the premises are true? Imagine you live in a world where if you're a human, then you're invisible. If you then learn that you're a human, yep, you're going to be invisible. So the argument is valid, it's just not sound. And the reason it's not sound is because it's got a false first premise. That doesn't change the fact that this argument form is a valid argument form, and anytime you have an argument in that form, it's going to be valid. So that's the first two of our valid argument forms, our good argument forms using conditional sentences. Let's look at the second one, denying the consequent. Okay, and let's look at this example. If Maryland makes a strong offer, then the coach is going to Maryland. The coach is not going to Maryland, therefore Maryland did not make a strong offer. Now, the difference with this argument from the previous one is twofold. First, our second premise, rather than being the antecedent, is the consequent. But it's not just the consequent, it's the denial of the consequent. The form of the argument looks like this. If P, then Q. Not Q, therefore not P. Anytime an argument has this form, it will be valid. So stop and think about it this sort of way to try to think about why this is true. So let's say your friend is this person who's thinking about taking the coaching job in Maryland. And you know that if Maryland makes a strong offer, then your friend is going to go take the coaching job in Maryland. She's already said this to you. So then later on, if you learn that she's not going to go to Maryland, well, then you know, it must not have been a strong offer from Maryland. Because if the offer had been strong, then she would have taken the coaching job. Okay. And just like with affirming the antecedent, denying the consequent, these arguments can still have false premises and a false conclusion. It just doesn't change the fact that it's valid. So take this one, for example. If it's 1 p.m., then it's Wednesday. It's not Wednesday, therefore it's not 1 p.m. Now, of course, this argument isn't sound because it's not the case that if it's 1 p.m., then it's Wednesday. 1 p.m. happens every day of the week at some point. So learning that it's not Wednesday isn't a sufficient way to learn that it's not 1 p.m. But imagine that if these premises are true, then knowing that it's not Wednesday gives you enough information to know it's not 1 p.m. Before turning to the two bad fallacious forms of reasoning with conditionals that we're going to look at, let's test out some examples of the two skills we've just learned. Okay, so take a look at this partially filled out argument. We've got the first premise here. If Cher performs, then Paul will go to the concert. We know there's going to be a second premise and then a conclusion. If we're going to do an example of denying the consequent, what have we got to do? Take a second to think about it. How do you fill out this argument if we're denying the consequent? The answer is we negate the consequent. We say that Paul will not go to the concert, and we conclude from that the negation, the not, for the antecedent as well. Cher will not perform. So we've got the case of if P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. Alright, let's look at this argument form. Again, we've got the same first premise, and there's going to be a second premise, and then there's going to be our conclusion. But this time we're affirming the antecedent. Now what do you do? The answer is you just put the antecedent in on the next line, and then conclude the consequent. Really straightforward. Alright, so those are the two good argument forms. They both have other names, other really common names that they go by. The other name for affirming the antecedent is modus ponens, which means in Latin, the way of putting in place. And then, denying the consequent, another name for that is modus tollens, which means in Latin, the way of taking away. You don't need to know what these things mean in Latin, but if you ever take a logic course or just start listening to people talk about arguments, odds are good you'll come across the terms modus ponens and modus tollens. These are just really common names for the types of arguments we've just learned about. Affirming the antecedent for modus ponens and denying the consequent for modus tollens. We've been looking at nicely organized little arguments in this slideshow, but in the real world, arguments are messier. And often conditional arguments are going to have an unstated second premise or an unstated conclusion, or sometimes neither will be stated. So it's your job to be thinking about when is someone really making a conditional argument, even if they don't put all the pieces out there explicitly. Alright, so now let's turn to the fallacious forms of reasoning. Let's start with affirming the consequent. Affirming the consequent has the following form. If P, then Q. Q, therefore P. Now, the tricky thing about this particular fallacious form of reasoning is it looks so much like both modus tollens and modus ponens. But, if we look at the example, you can see it's not valid. So, here we start out with our conditional. If Cincinnati is the capital of Ohio, then Cincinnati is in Ohio. Now, that's true. If something's going to be the capital of a state, it has to be in that state. So that conditional is true. It also follows. It's also true that Cincinnati is in Ohio. But if we're using the form of affirming the consequent, if P then Q, Q therefore P, the conclusion one would reach is Cincinnati is the capital of Ohio. But it's not the capital of Ohio. That's Columbus. But here you've just seen both premises are true and the conclusion is false. Therefore, this argument can't possibly be valid. That's exactly the circumstance under which an argument isn't valid, when both the premises are true and the conclusion is false. So what's going on here? The problem is that when we do the reverse, when we conclude from the presence of Q that P is also the case, we've not taken into account the fact that there's lots of different ways by which Q could be true. Cincinnati can be in Ohio so long as it's a city in Ohio. It doesn't have to be specifically the capital city. Being the capital city in Ohio is one way to guarantee that something's a city in Ohio, but it's not the only way. And because it's not the only way, we can't do the reverse sort of reasoning that we do with affirming the antecedent or denying the consequent. So this argument form, it's bad. It's no good. But it looks deceptively similar to good argument forms, which is why it can be so tricky and so appealing. Alright, denying the antecedent. Let's take the same little example for our first premise. If Cincinnati is the capital of Ohio, then Cincinnati is in Ohio. Sorry, that should be then, not the. But if we're denying the antecedent, then what do? Well, we negate this first claim. Cincinnati is not the capital of Ohio. Then, on this particular fallacious form of reasoning, you conclude, aha! Cincinnati is not in Ohio. But that, of course, is false. Cincinnati is in Ohio, even though it's not the capital of Ohio. The problem is we use this form of reasoning. If P, then Q, not P, therefore not Q. And this is just a bad form of reasoning. It's fallacious. Both the premises can be true, and the conclusion can still be false. So in summary, conditionals can be used to make a variety of different valid types of arguments, which are really useful, but they also can be used in subtle ways to make fallacious arguments that are no good. So it's your job to just pay attention and try to figure out which are which.